If somebody just wants to like get a status of their delivery, or they're getting a package like USPS has USPS tracking, I'm not really going to put authentication on that. I'm just going to let people call the API, put in their tracking information and get a response. So in that situation, those are like self-serve APIs where I don't really want to have a whole approval process for that because anybody could really be using the tracking system, and I already have it open to the public. But vetted APIs are essentially where my money is, and that's where I want to basically implement my security and everything and ensure that whoever is consuming my APIs is actually compliant. So we usually give them about 60 days in the sandbox environment before they can essentially consume our production API. And as far as like the access tiers, to break down, like I said, self-serve APIs compared to vetted APIs, we have actually developer, basic, and standard tiers, which is essentially every tier has different limitations. So from a limitations perspective, what I mean is like the client credential that I issue when somebody requests access to my API, I can limit how many times they can come with those credentials and request access. So basically that essentially means how many sessions can they have from their application to my API. And I can throttle that by limiting the number of access tokens they can get using those credentials. Any questions on that? All right. So now we're moving into API governance. This is where the security piece is coming into place. So in Apigee, they have something called shared flows. Shared flow is essentially a sequence of policies, ideally covering a specific functionality that can be referenced and reused by API proxies. So let's say I'm a developer in an environment and we have Apigee, and I came up with this really cool security policy that essentially checks and validates everything before it hits my API proxy. And I'm another developer now. Now I have a very similar API, and I could totally leverage a security policy. I can share that. I can create a shared flow. Anybody can take my security policy and apply it to their API proxy. This actually allows us to make everything as code. So even our security is as code because I can create shared flows using the same pipeline that I showed before. The same pipeline to use API proxies, I can create shared flows using those same pipelines. This way, I can give folks like Tom access to security, what security do we have implemented? They can just go and check out the pipeline and say, okay, these are the changes that we have. So, and as far as like from a governance perspective now overall, right, it's great that a developer can create a security policy and I can use it from an ops team perspective. So I'm one of the main administrators for Apigee for a major customer that we have. And essentially what I've done is I've taken the same concept of sharing security, but I've applied it to the environment level. What that essentially means is that if I have a non-prod environment, any API proxy that will be deployed to that environment will automatically get my security policy. And in that policy, I also have conditions where essentially I'm trying to make it as generic as possible that even if the API proxy does not meet all of my requirements from a security policy, it will still work because it will just do a conditional check. Does it have basic authentication? Okay, it doesn't have basic authentication. Does it have OAuth? It does have OAuth. Okay, use OAuth and verify the client credentials that are coming in. How do I want to do the logging? So like I was saying, the same pipelines can be used to create the shared flow. So from a security policy perspective, these are the options that I have. So if you look at the options that we have, where did it go? So XML to JSON, XML transformation, JSON to XML. If we look at the security policies, we got access control policy, basic authentication, JSON threat protection, decode JWT, if anybody knows JSON Web Token, it also supports JSON Web Token if you don't like OAuth for any reason. And as far as prevention, there has regular expression protection, XML threat protection. You can do verify API key. I mean, the list keeps going on and on. But essentially, the point is that the core security features that you would want on your API are essentially out of the box. The worry of security being a concern, you can actually just, if you look at the small diagram on the right side, they have a very intuitive UI as well. So I can keep dragging like the policies into those windows and make the order that I want. So just to give you a visual representation of how a shared flow works. So as you can see over here, there are 4 hooks that I have on an environment. I have a pre-proxy, pre-target, post-target, and post-proxy. So keeping those 4 in mind, let's see where they fall. So pre-proxy shared flow is essentially all the security policies I want to run even before it hits my API proxy. So in there I have a global callout, I have a concurrent rate limit, I have a quota, I have spike arrest, I'm calling out a security policy and an error handler policy. So there's a lot going on way up front. So if that gets through, it will be able to hit my API proxy. Now on my API proxy, I have my own security policy, which is also going to be checked and validated. So once it goes through those checks, before it gets to the target backend, it's going to get another security policy. And at that point, I'm essentially just looking for errors and logging. Once it gets to the backend and a response comes out to the API proxy, before it hits the, after the post target, essentially, I'm logging whatever happened over there. And before it makes it back to the API proxy, after it makes it to the API proxy, before it makes it to the client that made that request, I'm throwing in another logging call out. So you can see how essentially I'm controlling, I have complete control over my API. Does everybody see that? Like from a, or if anything, it's overkill, in my opinion. But at the same time, you know for a fact that all of these checks and balances are being done as part of your complete interaction with your consumer. And I think from a security perspective, that alleviates or makes you feel a lot more better about exposing your APIs, because you know you have all these different validation and checks in place, which are always going to be called. So the odds of you getting hit, you know, are very low. So, yep, that's the end of the thing. But yes, sir.
So the real reason I wanted to bring you all here, I'm Tom Howell, I'm program director here, and I brought you here. And the reason why I think this is so compelling from a security standpoint is 2 things. One is you can create these templates to control your apps, but yep, you also get a single pane of glass to be able to look at all of the APIs that you're exposing, because almost everybody's got a bunch of applications exposed to the public in one way or another, but they're scattered across multiple servers and services and different places, and really the only way to find them is by doing a Nexus scan, is by scanning your environment and looking for open ports. This is a way of documenting all of your open applications in a single place and being able to audit the security policies around those, so that you're not just looking at firewall rules to see what you've got open to the world. You can see what you're exposing, who it's exposed to, and what the conditions are for exposing it to folks. And I think it's really complicated to get your head around the idea of microservices and APIs, and I don't fully understand it myself. But I love the idea. Don't let that intimidate you, because this seems like real propeller head, you know, millennial developer sort of crazy Amazon startup stuff, and it is. But it's also from a conservative risk management point of view. This is a really great way to manage this inevitable exposure of more data and more applications to the public, and they've, I've sort of gotten sold on it with more research, and it bears more looking at, and it's just the tip of a huge iceberg of continuous integration and deployment and pipelines and Jenkins and all these weird hipster names.
Like even like, you know, like before I mentioned when I was talking about microservices, what we need to understand is that the backend still has those DevSecOps CI/CD pipelines creating those services in the back end. We're doing a lot of overkill from a security perspective, but it's not like we're giving up security on the back end. We're still securing our back end. We're still doing rigorous testing and checking against our services that we're exposing. And as you can see, they can be anywhere you want it to be. And essentially, we're adding an extreme thick layer of security on top of that to expose it to the world. And And as far as like visibility, like Tom said, you can see everything in one place. You can see exactly how your API is being consumed, who is consuming your API. You can even see where in the world the API requests are coming from. Like, it's that intense. Like, you can pinpoint and see if you can, I mean, if you were a commercial company and you could see that there are a lot of requests coming from UK a lot, maybe it makes sense for you to put something closer to UK from an API perspective and, you know, leverage the same security. You had a question, sir? Okay. Yes, sir.
So if your product supports IPv6,
IPv6.
We haven't leveraged
I haven't leveraged IPv6 yet
yes,
for this.
Google.
Even in the federal space, we haven't explored.
So I mean, what do you mean by IPv6? Like as far as like the cluster itself, or communicating with an IPv6
so
server?
you have a microservices, whatever you coded, whatever the code in there, whether you have, I mentioned earlier, you have a hard-coded IP address,
Yeah.
most likely will be v4.
Yeah,
And you have a fully qualified domain name, and you can easily change it to v4, v6.
yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a,
that's a lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think even though
Not
IPv6,
IPv4.
IPv6 is gonna be a big thing, but I think not a lot of people are there yet, like.
Inside it's all.
Sorry, I mean, maybe you are, I haven't seen it
So
myself.
if you're talking about the cloud migration, if you're talking about IoT or blockchain or
Oh,
anything,
yeah.
emerging technologies,
Yeah,
or smart cars,
yeah,
you have to use IPv6.
per square foot, yes,
If you have any product and you need IP address,
yeah,
nowadays you cannot get IPv4.
yeah.
You have to pay.
Well, that brings up a good point. I mean, is this routable, or is it already internal in a NAT environment?
So this can work in IPv6 network as well.
From a cluster
But,
perspective, yeah.
With our customers where we support, we haven't yet explored IPv6 with these platforms.
I mean, so what we need to understand is Apigee comes in two flavors. It comes as software as a service and platform as a service. So if I wanted to deploy it into AWS and use IPv6, yes, I can use that.
External.
And especially Verizon, 90% of Verizon 4G customers is already using IPv6.
Interesting.
If your product is not capable of supporting that,
Yeah, yeah,
eventually you'll lose a lot of customers,
yeah, yeah,
especially probably international.
yeah.
Yeah, Apigee supports IPv6.
It does.
It does support IPv6, but I haven't
Incoming client.
done IPv6 myself with Apigee.
That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So any more questions? That was actually the last slide that we had for the day. I think we're good then.
Just to be on the fair, right? The vendor side, Apigee is not the only platform.
Yeah.
There are many others, like Red Hat has Zscaler, MuleSoft has one,
Yep.
TIBCO has one, so there are many other platforms, they have similar
And
capabilities.
they follow the same pattern from creation and exposing. So like the dev portal concept, like exposing your services using the dev portal concept, that's actually across the board. So everybody uses that format as far as exposing their APIs and consuming their APIs. So, yes, sir.
Is the slides available
Um,
online or somewhere?
Sure, we can make them available to Tom, and he can send it out to the group.
Yeah, if you make them available to us, we'll post them on our website,
Okay,
then you'll be able to download them.
sure.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You had a question?
Sorry, talking about the various providers, like API services, like Apigee, or let's say API Gateway, AWS,
Yep.
does it make sense to kind of use a dual sourcing approach? Like I know a lot of people are using two cloud services because they
Yeah.
don't want to be tied down to one.
Mhm.
Would it make sense to use two kind of API services, or is it better to stick to one in this case?
It really depends if both of those, so the key thing for API management is standardization. You need to be able to standardize your API development processes, right, in a way. So if you can find two platforms that can let you do it the same way, I think you can. And I, like, just like you said, like
Yeah, I don't know
multiple
the answer to the
CSPs.
question either, I'm just,
Yeah.
wondering.
I mean, I think that would be a good one, but I think my understanding so far by dealing with these platforms is that every customer that is looking for this is actually looking for standardization across the board. if you wanted to do like high availability or disaster recovery from a perspective of having 2 different clusters of same apogee, that could work as well. But
Using different products would make it overly complicated.
that's
to
what I'm saying,
support.
then there are gonna be 2 standards, right? Unless you find something like very similar to each other, which will kind of defeat the purpose for you to pay 2 licensing fees for a similar product.
And then you lose your single pane of glass too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that too,
Yeah.
the visibility, yep. I mean, you can send all your logs to Splunk and make some cool dashboards out of it, but you're kind of creating a hacky solution yourself now at that point.
Or
When
log.
you have, yeah. All right, well, good. All right, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for your rush. We really appreciate it, got a lot out of this. This is definitely not my field, but I tried to absorb as much as I could. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you for coming out. Couple of admin things again.